This is the Bizgnus Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
By just about any definition, these are not good times. We're trying to cope with a pandemic that could be the worst in a century. The economy has tanked for many companies and their workers. Politics seems like just unending trench warfare. And then you add in typical workplace issues, many of which, because of those outside pressures, are anything but typical these days. Include in that list grief counseling when one of your staff suffers the loss of a loved one. With us on this Bizgnus podcast is an expert in how managers should deal with grief, Anthony Casablanca. Anthony, would you give our audiences first a brief sketch of your background?
Spent 31 years with a company called Hillenbrand Inc. And actually, I can go a little bit further back than that. I graduated from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, with an accounting degree, and then subsequently wound up at Hillenbrand. Spent 31 years working for them, and 28 of those years was spent on they owned their largest subsidiary at the time was a company called Batesville Casket Company, which actually has a distribution center in Fresno, by the way. And so spent 28 years with them on the Batesville Casket Company side of the business, and had a whole host of roles. But the last 10 or 12 years, I was the vice president of human resources for them. Then I took over all of their manufacturing and logistics organizations. So I was the vice president of supply chain. And then at around 2012, late 2011, Hillenbrand tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, we'd like you to go run an acquisition that we've made in Cincinnati, a company called Rotex, which was a $100 million business. They make high accuracy, high volume screening equipment for dry bulk goods. So think Green Mountain coffee is something that they would screen, anything that requires a very fine particle size. And so I spent the last 3 years of my total of 31 years with Hillenbrand running that organization. So that's a little bit of my background. My brother, on the other hand, is a duly licensed funeral director. And he's currently running a fairly large funeral home out in Fort Collins, Colorado. And he's owned a couple of businesses and done some consulting in his own right. And so together, we came together and wrote the book, The Dying Art of Leadership, and started our leadership training company called Grief Leaders.
Now, managers, as you well know, have enough on their plate as it is. But when you have a staff member who comes to you and says, well, my spouse or significant other of some kind, a close relative, has just died, how on earth do you handle that? The old days was you said, well, the company policy says you got 3 days. See you back on Friday. So what do you really do today?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the old days really haven't gone away all that much. Most companies, a lot of companies still have the sort of 3-day policy thing. In our book and in our training, there's two points that we try to make. The first one is that grief is triggered by any emotional traumatic event that happens in someone's life. So it doesn't have to be a loss of a loved one. It can be a divorce. It can be a significant illness diagnosis of the person or a family member. The list goes on and on. Even companies' own initiatives can trigger an employee to grieve. If you think about closing a facility or laying people off or putting in some major project that's going to dramatically change the way people do their work or how many people do the work, all of those things can cause an employee to enter the grief process. Some things it takes longer to heal than others. The death of a loved one is typically the one that most people think about. But as part of what we do, we try to get leaders to understand that, especially in today's world, it's not just the loss of a loved one, right? You may not know what your employee is really dealing with think about the lockdowns and the state of the economy, and my spouse has lost her job and we needed her second income to pay the bills, and so there's now all that pressure. So that's the first thing that we try to do in our training and in the book. But by and large, what we suggest that leaders do today, regardless of your company's policies, because we are not on a mission to get everybody to give folks 30 days off and those kinds of things. Nor are we on a mission to have leaders be grief counselors. That's not in our purview, right? That's not what a manager or a leader should do. But what they should do is not wait for performance to slip and not assume that they know why performance has slipped, right? Sit down and have the conversation with someone about, hey, I've noticed you've been late to meetings, or you've made some errors lately. That's not like you. Let's talk a little bit about this. Is there something going on that you want to tell us or that we should know about? Because the organization would really like to help you through whatever it is that you're dealing with. And just engage in the conversation. You're so right in what you've said. There is no leadership training. Leaders are never exposed to how to deal with somebody coming in and saying, my wife was just diagnosed with cancer, or I've been diagnosed with a significant illness, or whatever the case may be. And so we try to provide in our book and in our leadership training program the skills and confidence that leaders need to begin to engage in these conversations, because they are awkward and they are uncomfortable and they are emotional. But when done correctly, they elevate the productivity and the morale and the engagement of the entire team.
What happens when the manager feels like he or she is caught between the famous rock and the famous hard place, trying to help their staff member, but faced by that guy down the hall who's their boss and says,
Right.
I have 3 days, that's it.
Right.
What do you do?
Well, so, interestingly, I think we learned just how much flexibility we have as we dealt with COVID as a nation, right? That same company probably had no hesitation in telling everybody to just work from home, something that they probably would have never, ever thought to do before, or would have been against company policies. What we found, and frankly, what I found, because in my role as the vice president of both as human resources and later in my role as the vice president of supply chain, Batesville Casket Company was a union organization. My time at Rotex, they were a union organization. And even with union contracts, leaders can have a great deal of flexibility, even with company policies and with union contracts, because we're not talking about telling somebody that, hey, go take a month off with pay. That's not what we're really saying. Is let's make it so that you can talk about this at work and we can deal openly with it at work. And while I may not be able to give you the flexibility to take 20 days off, I certainly have the flexibility to take some of your responsibilities and divvy them up to the rest of the team. And I certainly have the flexibility to understand that you may not always be fully present in a meeting, and I should be sensitive to that as opposed to calling it out or criticizing you for it. I certainly have lots of flexibility to understand that I may come into your office one day and you might be sitting there crying. And I now know why, as opposed to not, right? So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about providing leaders with the skills and confidence to actually engage the employee in their grief process, listen, and then figure out ways to adapt your leadership style within the flexibility that you have to help this employee in a time when they need support the most. That's really what the employee needs. 2 things: the ability to talk about this at work and support. And today, most organizations don't have processes that allow their leaders to do either one of those things.
Are you also suggesting we can learn empathy There are certain bosses around that seem to have no empathy, and
Yeah,
others who seem to have it in abundance.
I think so. I think you can learn empathy. You have to work at it. Actually, as so, it's very interesting that you've asked this question. We've done lots and lots of interviews since our book came out, and this is the first time anyone has asked us that question. As part of our leadership training, we have actually partnered with an industrial psychology company up in the Cleveland, Ohio area, and we've developed a leadership assessment tool that will actually measure how what a leader's sort of natural propensity to adapt their leadership style, be compassionate, and be empathetic is. Because for some, this is a very innate, intuitive thing, and for others, you're going to have to work on it. But I do believe you can work on it, because I myself grew up in a culture where empathy was not, when I first started with Batesville Casket Company, empathy was not in the early 80s. Empathy was not on the list of priorities in our company culture. We were a do it or you're done kind of company. And you know, people are sort of a replaceable cog in the big machine. And we were able to change that culture through the 90s. And I personally was able to grow through awareness, right? So the whole purpose of that assessment tool is merely to bring awareness to one's sort of natural tendencies so that then you can go to work on them.
What trends do you see in this regard in the overall business climate in this country? Trending towards more empathy, more maybe that 20 days off with pay or something like that, or what?
So, you know, I've become acutely aware of the culture here, right? So, I noticed, so this project, which quickly moved to a mission and then a passion for my brother and I, actually started back in 2017 with an article in Harvard Business Review that we read about emotional well-being and grieving at work. And the article was a very good article, but we noticed as we began to research this that all of the articles sort of said you should be compassionate, but they didn't really tell you how to be compassionate, right? They said you should be empathetic, but there really weren't any processes being talked about. So I would say, you know, certainly over the last 3 to 4 years, we've been sensitized to it, but I think we are seeing a shift. And if you look at some of the things in social media, certainly on LinkedIn, there's a lot of talk about vulnerability. Simon Sinek talks a lot about empathy. So I think the culture, I think folks have begun to bring to the forefront that vulnerability, empathy, and compassion are requirements of leadership now. Where before, I'm not sure that we really talked all that much about empathy and compassion and vulnerability. Now it's sort of, hey, vulnerable leaders are the ones who are the most successful, is sort of the tone. And we're also beginning to see a trend toward particularly the high-tech organizations, Amazon, Facebook, some others, are beginning to give people 20 or 30 days off that they can use at their discretion. They can take them day at a time. They can take all 20 at once. We're seeing, we've dubbed it as the emotional well-being culture. We're seeing that begin to flourish. In fact, just today, I got a Harvard Business Review tip of the day, which was all about you should take a look at your company's bereavement policies. So I think it is shifting, and hopefully we can play a role in that, and specifically around this notion of when an emotionally traumatic event strikes an employee, how should leaders deal with that? How should organizations deal with that within the culture that they currently have, and then hopefully influence that culture a little bit.
As you and your brother were writing this book, you probably came upon a couple of aha moments. We hadn't thought about that before. What might
Hmm.
that be?
So there are really two of them that stick out in our mind. One is, and these both have to do with the research that we did. So I guess there would really be three. There's really three. The first one was the studies have indicated that grief in the workplace costs companies just in the U.S. about $75 billion a year in lost productivity. That no amount of continuous improvement and Kaizen events and lean is ever going to find, right? Because it's not a failure of processes. It is people who just can't concentrate at work. It's they're unsafe, they're distracted, they're depressed, they're staring off into space, they're not paying attention in meetings, they're making mistakes. So that was the first really big learning. And frankly, that number is dated. The last study that was done was in 2003 by the Grief Recovery Institute. They've begun to update those numbers, and they have indicated, although I've not seen anything formally published, that that number is probably over $100 billion a year now. So this is a big deal. We had the exact same reaction you just had. We were like, holy cow, how is it that no one is talking about this? The second element that surprised us, and this came from the interviews that we conducted. The same two comments came up in almost every single interview that we conducted with people who had gone through a grief process at work. The first one was, if they were treated really well, and the way you and I have been discussing about the shift in culture with empathetic and compassionate leaders, if they were treated very well, those people said, it was such a relief to be able to talk about this at work, to be able to raise my hand and say, go into my boss's office and say, hey, I am struggling and I need help, and have the organization understand and rally around me, right? On the flip side, people who didn't work for an empathetic boss or a compassionate boss said, I wish I could have talked about this at work because I was really struggling and I felt I had nowhere to turn. And my boss just put more pressure on me and it made it worse. And I didn't know what to do, right? So that was the second big piece of learning. And the third one also came universally through people that we talked with, and many of the examples that we give in the book. Every single person said, they all ended their story with this sentence: but if I worked for a different leader, I don't know if I would have been treated the same way. Which is an indication of the fact that organizations don't have processes for them to follow, for leaders to follow consistently, right? So those three things really stuck out in our minds as, it's not anybody's fault here. It's just, this is a very unspoken, unaddressed area of leadership. There was just an article in the Washington Post that ran about a week ago, and there was a quote in there. Actually, the title of the article was, "In today's world, we need grief leaders now more than ever." And in the article, they quoted a professor from Maryville University, a leadership professor, who said in all of her years of experience, she has never seen this topic addressed in any leadership programs. And that's what we're trying to change.
Give our listeners and viewers the name of the book again.
Sure. So it's The Dying Art of Leadership: How Leaders Can Help Grieving Employees Excel at Work.
And tell them a little bit about a website, perhaps?
Sure. So folks can follow us or go to our website at griefleaders.com. Or they can follow us on LinkedIn as well. Either follow myself or my brother Guy, either one. And we do have a Grief Leaders company page as well on LinkedIn where they can follow the organization and all the work we're doing.
Anthony, you have certainly raised a lot of issues, and I'm sure a lot of eyebrows when people watch this or listen to it. What would you like to add that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
So If I could just give leaders 3 quick tips before we get off the phone, just to get there, just sort of to open the door a little bit to spur some food for thought. When you're faced with a situation like this, engage. It's not going to be second nature for you to want to do that, but engage with the employee, not in a threatening your job's on the line kind of way, but in a let's go grab a cup of coffee. I'm concerned about you. The organization wants to help you. Talk to me about what's going on so we can figure out how to support you, right? While I may not be able to give you 30 days off, but I can certainly support you while you're here at work for 6 months or a year if we have to make sure that you have the space you need to get through this time, right? That's one. The second is when you have the conversation, you have to be willing then to adapt your leadership style, which is really what we teach in our leadership training. It doesn't do any good to have the conversation and then say, okay, well, so suck it up and get back to work, right? That doesn't help at all, right? So be prepared that with the employee to make changes to their responsibilities, to their workload, to their hours, to as much as you can be flexible, but partner with them, right? So that it's their solution as well. And then the third one, which often gets overlooked, is involve the team. Because the team wants to help this person, but doesn't know how. And so involve the team, because if you go to the team and say, we need to help Doug out because he's going through a tough time right now. Here's what Doug and I have talked about. Anthony, I need you to pick up this project. Doris, I need you to attend these meetings. We need to give Doug a little bit of flexibility here. He's probably going to come in late to work because some mornings he's not going to be up to coming in early. He may have to leave early because he's undergoing treatments. We just need to be really, really flexible. You will be amazed at how the team responds, and you will see overall engagement, morale, loyalty, productivity will all increase because the team will realize that they work for at least a leader, if not an organization that really cares about them as people. Those would be the 3 tips.
You've been watching the Bizgnus podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@bizgnus.com. Thanks for watching.